When my brother told us he was sick, I never questioned it. Who would lie about something so serious? My family poured their love and resources into helping him, but when I uncovered the truth, it wasn't gratitude I received. Instead, my family turned their anger on me, and everything fell apart. It started on a quiet Sunday evening. Dinner was its usual routine. Dad telling one of his recycled dad jokes. Mom asking Jake and me about our week, and Jake poking at his food like he always did when he wasn't in the mood to talk. But something was off about him that night. For weeks, Jake had been different, distracted, moody, and avoiding his usual jokes or banter with me. He spent most of his time in his room, doors shut and headphones on. I chalked it up to stress, or maybe a breakup he hadn't told us about. But that night, everything changed. Jake suddenly dropped his fork, the metallic clink startling us. He cleared his throat, his expression serious. "I've been feeling really off lately," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I went to the doctor last week, and it doesn't look good." Mom froze, her glass of water halfway to her lips, her eyes wide. "What do you mean, Jake?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake hesitated, looking down at his plate, as if searching for the right words. "They think it might be cancer," he finally said. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. Tears instantly filled Mom's eyes as she stood up and moved to his side, wrapping her arms around him. Dad leaned forward, his face pale and his brow furrowed. "What kind of cancer? What did they say exactly?" he asked, his voice calm but insistent. Jake sighed heavily, as though the weight of the questions was too much. "They're still running tests," he said. "The doctor didn't want to say too much yet. They'll let me know more soon." The room fell into a stunned silence. Mom clung to Jake, as if holding him could somehow shield him from whatever was coming. Dad, ever the practical one, immediately started talking about treatment options, insurance, and whether they'd need to take time off to help Jake through his appointments. That night, the entire atmosphere in the house shifted. Mom barely slept, spending hours researching cancer symptoms and treatments online. Dad started poring over their finances, mumbling about how they could dip into their retirement savings if Jake needed it. I wanted to be as supportive as they were, but something didn't sit right with me. Jake was good at hiding things, but this felt different. His announcement had been dramatic, almost too dramatic, and his answers to our questions had been vague at best. Still, I told myself I was overthinking it. Who would lie about something so serious? Jake's behavior in the days that followed didn't help ease my suspicions. He let Mom dote on him, cooking his favorite meals and excusing him from chores, and he soaked up Dad's concern like a sponge. While my parents were wrapped around his finger, I couldn't ignore the growing knot of doubt in my chest. Something about Jake's story didn't add up, and I had a sinking feeling I was about to find out why. Jake's announcement changed everything. Overnight, he became the focal point of our family. Mom cooked elaborate dinners every evening, always Jake's favorites, and fussed over him as if he were made of glass. Dad, who normally lectured Jake about contributing more around the house, suddenly stopped mentioning jobs or responsibilities. Even I, despite my lingering doubts, found myself picking up his slack without complaint. At first it felt right. Jake deserved our support if he was really sick. Cancer wasn't something you questioned, especially not when the person affected was your brother. But as the days stretched into weeks, I started noticing little things that didn't add up. Jake didn't seem sick. He wasn't pale or tired. He didn't lose weight or show any of the symptoms Mom had listed from her hours of online research. He spent most of his time lounging in front of the TV or playing video games, laughing and joking as if nothing was wrong. And then there was the glaring absence of any medication or treatment plans. When I asked him how the tests were going, his answers were vague. "The doctor said they'll call me soon," or "I don't want to get into it until I know for sure." At first, I tried to dismiss my doubts. Jake was private and hated being vulnerable, so maybe he was just uncomfortable talking about it. But the more evasive he became, the harder it was to ignore the nagging voice in the back of my head. I started paying closer attention, looking for signs that something was really wrong. But all I saw were inconsistencies. Jake would act subdued and serious when our parents were around, but the second he thought no one was watching, he'd go back to his old, carefree self. The turning point came late one night. I was in my room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard Jake talking on the phone with one of his friends. His laughter carried through the thin walls, and I could hear him pacing in his room. At first, I tried to tune it out. It wasn't unusual for Jake to stay up late chatting. But then I caught a snippet of his conversation that made my stomach churn. "What can I say? It's working," Jake said, his voice dripping with smugness. "They're finally off my back about everything. I should have done this sooner." I sat up in bed, straining to hear more. No, he continued. It's not like they'll find out. I just have to keep it going for a while. Mom's already talking about helping with medical expenses. My heart sank. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was Jake joking? Or was this confirmation of the doubt that had been growing inside me for weeks? I waited until the conversation ended, my mind racing. I wanted to confront him right then and there, but I hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if there was some explanation for what I'd heard? Accusing him without proof would only drive a wedge between us. And if he really was sick, I'd never forgive myself. The next morning, I tried to act normal. At breakfast, Mom brought Jake a plate of pancakes while Dad asked if he needed help scheduling his next doctor's appointment. Jake smiled and waved them off. "It's all under control," he said, his tone casual. I studied him carefully, looking for any cracks in his story. He seemed completely at ease, basking in the attention. It was enough to make me question everything. Was I imagining things? Was I reading too much into a conversation I hadn't fully heard? But deep down, I knew I couldn't let it go. Jake's behavior didn't add up, and the idea that he might be lying about something as serious as cancer was too big to ignore. I decided to dig deeper, to gather the proof I needed before confronting him. If Jake was faking, I had to know. And if he wasn't, well, I'd deal with the guilt later. That night, the house was unusually quiet. Mom and Dad had gone to bed early, and I was in my room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, trying to push my doubts about Jake to the back of my mind. But then I heard it, a muffled laugh from his room. At first, I didn't think much of it. Jake was always up late, and he often called his friends when the rest of us were asleep. But something about the laugh was different this time. Louder, carefree, and completely out of place given his supposed diagnosis. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept closer to his door. His voice was low, but clear enough to hear through the thin walls. "What can I say?" Jake said, the humor in his tone unmistakable. "It's working. They're practically waiting on me hand and foot." My stomach tightened. I pressed my ear closer, straining to catch every word. "No, dude," he continued, still laughing. "I'm not worried. They won't find out. Mom's already talking about covering treatment costs." A wave of nausea hit me. I wanted to believe I was misunderstanding, that maybe this was some dark joke or a private venting session taken out of context. But his tone was so casual, so smug, that it felt like a slap in the face. "Yeah," Jake said, pausing for a moment. "I just need to keep it going for a little while longer. Once I figure out what I'm going to do next, I'll come up with something to get them off my back." My hands clenched into fists, and my heart pounded in my ears. Was this really happening? My brother was lying about being sick? I felt a mix of anger and disbelief, my mind racing with the implications. What made it worse was that my parents had poured their energy into supporting him. Mom was cooking every meal like it was his last. Dad had been talking about dipping into their savings, something he'd always been reluctant to do, even in emergencies. I debated bursting into the room right then and there, demanding an explanation. But I held back. Jake was good at talking his way out of things, and without solid proof, he'd just spin the situation to make me look crazy or cruel. Instead, I crept back to my room, my mind spinning with questions. What exactly was Jake planning? How far was he willing to go to manipulate our parents? And most importantly, why would he do this in the first place? The next morning, I couldn't even look at him. As he strolled into the kitchen, humming to himself and joking with Mom about her legendary pancakes, I felt my stomach churn. How could he act so normal, so carefree, while lying to the people who loved him most? "You seem chipper this morning," I said, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. Jake glanced at me, his smile faltering for just a moment before he recovered. "What can I say? Gotta stay positive, right?" It was a subtle dig, but it stung. I forced a tight smile and excused myself, knowing I couldn't keep my suspicions bottled up forever. That day, I resolved to dig deeper. I needed more than overheard snippets of a phone call. I needed hard evidence. I started paying closer attention to Jake's behavior, taking note of the inconsistencies. He always claimed he had appointments, but there were no reminders on his phone or paperwork lying around. I checked the bathroom cabinets for medication, but there was nothing unusual, no prescriptions or pill bottles. The more I looked, the more certain I became. Jake wasn't sick. But exposing him wouldn't just be about proving the truth. It would mean taking on the emotional fallout of revealing his lies to Mom and Dad. As angry as I was, I couldn't shake the fear of what would happen when the truth came out. Would they believe me? Or would Jake's charm and manipulation turn them against me? I had no idea what I was walking into. But one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The more I thought about the phone call I'd overheard, the harder it became to stay quiet. I woke up the next morning determined to get answers. Jake strolled into the kitchen looking as carefree as ever, casually scrolling through his phone while Mom bustled around making breakfast. "How's everything going with the doctor?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Any updates on your next appointment?" Jake looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why do you want to know?" he asked, his voice defensive. "Just curious," I said with a shrug. "I mean, we're all worried about you." "Yeah, well, I'll let you know when there's something to tell," he said curtly, shoving his phone into his pocket. Then, as if to underline the conversation's end, he grabbed a plate of pancakes and left the room without another word. His defensiveness only fueled my suspicion. If Jake was really sick, why wouldn't he want us to know more? Why wouldn't he welcome our support instead of brushing off questions? Later that afternoon, Jake left the house to meet up with friends. The moment the door shut behind him, I went into action. I felt a pang of guilt as I crept into his room. It wasn't something I'd ever done before, but I told myself I had no choice. Jake's room was a mess, as usual. Clothes were piled on the floor, and empty soda cans littered his desk. I started by checking the obvious places: his nightstand, the top drawer of his dresser, but there was nothing unusual. No medication bottles, no appointment reminders, no pamphlets from doctors' offices or hospitals. I was starting to think I wouldn't find anything when I noticed a stack of papers on his desk, half buried under a pile of unopened mail. I pulled them out and froze. They were medical bills, or at least they looked like medical bills. The papers were blank except for Jake's handwriting scrawled across the top of each page. He'd written fake names, dates, and even dollar amounts in an attempt to make them look official. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just an exaggeration or a misunderstanding. Jake was deliberately fabricating evidence to support his lie. The pit in my stomach grew deeper as I thought about what this meant. He wasn't just pretending to be sick. He was manipulating our parents' love and concern, stealing their sympathy, and potentially putting their financial future at risk. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I wanted to confront him immediately, to shove the papers in his face and demand an explanation. But I stopped myself. Jake was a master manipulator, and if I didn't have solid proof, he'd find a way to twist the situation and make me look like the bad guy. Instead, I took photos of the fake bills with my phone, carefully placing them back where I'd found them so Jake wouldn't notice. My hands were shaking as I left his room, my mind racing with questions. How far was he willing to go with this lie? Did he even feel guilty about what he was doing? Or was he so focused on getting what he wanted that he didn't care about the consequences? That evening, as we all sat down for dinner, I couldn't stop watching Jake. He was his usual self, charming, funny, and completely at ease. He cracked a joke about Dad's cooking, and Mom laughed like everything was normal. It made my blood boil. How could he sit there so calmly, knowing what he was putting them through? For the rest of the night, I kept my distance, trying to figure out my next move. Exposing Jake wasn't just about telling the truth. It would mean shattering my parents' image of him, breaking their hearts, and possibly tearing our family apart. I didn't want to believe he was capable of something so cruel. But the evidence was undeniable. Jake wasn't sick, and if I didn't do something soon, he was going to take advantage of our parents' trust in ways they might never recover from. Dinner that evening was unbearable. I sat at the table, barely touching my food, my eyes darting toward Jake every few seconds. He was in high spirits, laughing at one of Dad's jokes and teasing Mom about how much butter she used in the mashed potatoes. Watching him act so normal, so carefree, while knowing what I knew, it made my blood boil. I couldn't keep quiet any longer. As soon as the plates were cleared, I stood up, grabbed my phone, and pulled up the photos of the fake medical bills. I slapped my phone down on the table with the image displayed and turned to Jake. "Care to explain this?" I asked, my voice shaking with barely restrained anger. Jake froze, his smile vanishing in an instant. He stared at the screen, then at me, his face draining of color. "What's your problem?" he snapped, his voice defensive as he reached for the phone. I snatched it away before he could grab it. "Don't even try it, Jake," I said, my voice rising. "Mom, Dad, look at these. These are the medical bills Jake's been waving around. They're blank forms with his handwriting on them. He's faking everything." Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dad furrowed his brow, leaning forward to peer at the screen. "Jake," he said slowly, his voice heavy with confusion. "What is this? What's your sister talking about?" Jake stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane," he said, his voice loud and defensive. "She's making this up because she's jealous I'm getting attention for once." "Jealous?" I shot back, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. You've been lying to everyone, manipulating us, and you think this is about jealousy? Give me a break. Jake's face twisted with anger. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, grabbing the fake bills from the table and trying to shove them into his pocket. Jake! Mom cried, standing up. What's going on? Are you really sick or not? Jake hesitated, his eyes darting between Mom, Dad, and me. For a moment, I thought he was going to come clean, but then his face hardened and he doubled down. Of course I'm sick, he yelled. This is ridiculous. She's always trying to make me look bad. Can't you see what she's doing? Mom looked torn, her eyes filling with tears as she turned to me. Honey, why would you accuse your brother of something like this? Because it's true, I said, my voice cracking. I overheard him talking to his friend about how he's milking this for attention. I went into his room, and there's nothing, no medication, no doctor's notes, nothing. And these fake bills? They're proof he's lying. Liar! Jake shouted, his face red with fury. You went through my stuff? You're insane. That's enough, Dad said sharply, his voice cutting through the chaos. He stood up, his expression grave as he looked between us. Jake, if you're telling the truth, show us proof. Give us the name of your doctor, the hospital, anything. Jake's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He stammered something incoherent, then crossed his arms and glared at me. I don't have to prove anything to her, he muttered. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of Jake's refusal sinking in. Mom sat back down, tears streaming down her face. Jake, she whispered, her voice trembling. Please, just tell us the truth. Jake sighed, shaking his head. This is ridiculous, he muttered. I don't need this right now. I'm sick, and instead of supporting me, you're all attacking me. You're not sick, I yelled, slamming my hands on the table. Stop lying, Jake. I said that's enough. Dad roared, slamming his fist on the table. Both of you, enough. Jake seized the moment to storm out of the kitchen, slamming the door to his room behind him. The sound echoed through the house, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. Mom buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. Dad sat back down heavily, rubbing his temples. I stood there, my chest heaving with frustration and anger. Why don't you believe me? I finally said, my voice breaking. Look at the evidence. Look at how he's acting. He's lying, and you're letting him get away with it. Mom shook her head, her voice muffled by her hands. I can't believe it, she said, her words barely audible. Dad looked at me, his expression unreadable. Go to your room, he said quietly. I need to talk to your mother. I opened my mouth to protest, but the look in his eyes stopped me. Without another word, I turned and left, my heart pounding as I went to my room and shut the door. For the first time, I wondered if telling the truth had been the right choice. Instead of exposing Jake, all I'd done was create a divide that I wasn't sure my family could come back from. The moment Jake stormed off, slamming his door so hard the walls seemed to vibrate, the silence in the kitchen became unbearable. I stood frozen, my heart racing as Mom's tear-filled eyes locked onto mine. How could you say something like that to him? She whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Do you even realize what he's going through? Your brother is suffering, and you're calling him a liar? I opened my mouth to explain, but Dad cut me off before I could get a word out. You owe him an apology, he said, his tone stern and unwavering. I don't know what's gotten into you, but accusing Jake of something like this? It's cruel, and it's beneath you. For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. Cruel? I finally said, my voice shaking with anger and frustration. How is it cruel to want the truth? He's not sick, Dad. I've shown you the proof. Those medical bills are fake, and he won't even tell you the name of his doctor. Mom shook her head, her tears falling freely now. He's your brother, she said, her voice cracking. Why can't you just support him? Even if there's a chance you're right, and I don't believe you are. Why would you attack him like this instead of helping him through whatever he's going through? Because he's not going through anything. I shouted, my frustration boiling over. He's manipulating you. He's taking advantage of your love and your money, and you're letting him. Dad's face hardened, and he stood abruptly, towering over me in a way that made me feel small and insignificant. That's enough, he said sharply. I won't have you disrespecting your brother like this. You think you know better than the rest of us? You think you're some kind of investigator? I think I'm the only one willing to see the truth. I shot back, refusing to back down. You've always been jealous of Jake, Dad said, his voice laced with disappointment. Ever since you were kids, you couldn't stand it when he got attention. Well, this isn't about you, and your petty jealousy is going to tear this family apart. The words hit me like a slap in the face. I stared at him, blinking back tears, as the weight of what he'd just said sank in. He didn't believe me. Neither of them did. Jake, of course, had played his role perfectly. He'd stormed off before I could confront him with the full extent of his lies, leaving me to face the fallout alone. I could practically hear him laughing behind his closed door, knowing he'd successfully turned our parents against me. Mom turned to Dad, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to focus on helping Jake," she said, "not tearing him down. I don't know why she's acting this way, but she's clearly not thinking straight." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're seriously going to take his side after everything I've shown you?" I asked, my voice breaking. "You think I'd make something like this up just to hurt him?" Mom's gaze softened for a moment, but she didn't answer. Dad, however, didn't hesitate. "You owe Jake an apology," he repeated, his tone final. "And until you're ready to do that, I suggest you stay out of his way." I stormed out of the kitchen, slamming my own door behind me. Tears streamed down my face as I sat on the edge of my bed, my hands trembling with anger and disbelief. How could they not see what was right in front of them? How could they choose to believe Jake's lies over the truth? As much as I wanted to wallow in my frustration, I knew I couldn't give up. If I let Jake get away with this, it wouldn't just hurt me, it would hurt Mom and Dad too. They deserved to know the truth, even if it meant going against everything they wanted to believe. But for now, I was alone. Jake had turned the tables so perfectly that I couldn't help but feel like I was fighting a losing battle. I wiped my tears and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. If Jake thought he'd won, he was wrong. I wasn't going to let him keep lying, no matter what it took. I just had to figure out my next move. After the explosive confrontation, I felt trapped. No matter what I said, Mom and Dad refused to entertain the possibility that Jake was lying. He'd spun his story so perfectly, played the role of the suffering son so convincingly that they couldn't or wouldn't see the cracks in his facade. I overheard him talking to his friend about milking it. I insisted during one last attempt to explain. "I found fake medical bills in his room. What more do you need to see?" But my words only seemed to harden their resolve. "People deal with illness in their own ways," Mom said tearfully. "Maybe he's struggling to accept his diagnosis. Maybe he's trying to protect us from the worst of it. You don't understand how hard this must be for him." "Exactly," Dad added. "Until you have proof, real proof, you need to stop with these accusations. You're only making things worse." Their stubbornness was infuriating. But if they wanted proof, I'd give them proof. I decided to track Jake's movements, keeping a close eye on when he left the house and where he went. He claimed to have appointments at the local hospital, so one day, when he announced he was heading to a follow-up visit, I decided to follow him. I waited until he left, then slipped out behind him, staying far enough back that he wouldn't notice. My heart raced as I tailed him, half expecting him to head toward the hospital or a clinic. But instead, Jake turned into the parking lot of a coffee shop, where he met up with a group of friends. They laughed and joked as they sipped their drinks, Jake looking anything but someone grappling with a life-threatening illness. My stomach churned as I watched him. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Jake was deliberately lying, and he didn't even seem to care about the consequences. The next step was to dig deeper into his supposed medical history. Jake had mentioned a specific doctor's name during one of our family dinners, so I called the office, pretended to be a concerned sibling, hoping to confirm an appointment. "I'm sorry," the receptionist said after checking their records. "We don't have a patient by that name in our system." My worst fears were confirmed. Jake hadn't just exaggerated his condition. He'd fabricated it entirely. I kept going, checking receipts he left around the house and monitoring his spending. While Mom and Dad believed their son was battling cancer, Jake was using their sympathy as a free pass to splurge on video games, late-night takeout, and nights out with friends. Armed with this new information, I felt a mix of vindication and dread. I finally had the proof I needed to confront him and hopefully convince Mom and Dad of the truth. But as I prepared to lay everything out for them, I couldn't shake the fear that even this wouldn't be enough. That evening, I gathered the receipts, the notes from my call to the doctor's office, and screenshots of his social media posts showing him laughing and partying with friends. I spread them out on the dining table, waiting for Mom and Dad to sit down. "This is the proof you wanted," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Jake's not sick. He's lying to all of us." They examined the evidence in silence. I watched their faces carefully, hoping to see the dawning realization that Jake's story didn't hold up. But instead, Mom's expression hardened. "This proves nothing," she said quietly, but there was a tremble in her voice. "Are you serious?" I asked, incredulous. The doctor's office has no record of him. These receipts show he's spending your money on junk instead of treatment. What more do you need? Maybe he's just struggling, Mom said, tears pooling in her eyes. Maybe he hasn't told us everything because he's scared. You're his sibling. Why are you so determined to tear him down? Dad shook his head, looking more tired than I'd ever seen him. This is too much, he said. I don't know why you're so obsessed with this, but it needs to stop. Jake is our son. Until he tells us otherwise, we believe him. My jaw dropped. You'd rather believe a lie than face the truth? I asked, my voice rising. Mom's tears finally spilled over. You're the one tearing this family apart, she said. Not Jake. You. We've done everything to raise you two with love, and this is what we get in return. I stared at them, stunned into silence. No matter how much proof I showed, they refused to see it. Jake had spun his web so thoroughly that even the truth couldn't break through. As I walked away, I realized something painful. This wasn't just about Jake's lie. It was about my parents' unwillingness to confront the possibility that their golden boy could be anything less than perfect. And in their eyes, I was the villain for trying to pull back the curtain. You've always been jealous of Jake, Mom said, her voice trembling with anger. Her words cut through me like a knife. You've never been able to stand it when he gets attention. I opened my mouth to protest, but the lump in my throat made it impossible to speak. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. No matter how much proof I had shown, no matter how carefully I had laid out the facts, they refused to see it. Mom's tears and Dad's hardened expressions told me everything I needed to know. They weren't just blind to Jake's lies. They didn't want to see them. You think this is about jealousy? I finally managed to say, my voice breaking. I don't care about the attention, Mom. I care about the fact that Jake is lying to you, using you, and you're letting him. Mom shook her head, her eyes glistening with tears. I can't do this, she whispered, turning away from me. You're tearing this family apart. And for what? To prove a point? To make Jake look bad? Dad crossed his arms, his expression as cold as I'd ever seen it. We've had enough of this. Your name, he said sternly. You need to stop. Now. I stared at them, my heart pounding in my chest. Jake's lies had wrapped around them so tightly that they couldn't, or wouldn't, break free. And now I was the villain in my own family story. The house became unbearable after that night. Jake avoided me entirely, staying in his room or leaving the house whenever I was around. When we did cross paths, he wouldn't even look at me. Mom and Dad, meanwhile, barely spoke to me unless it was to scold me for my behavior. The warmth that had once defined our home was gone, replaced by a tense silence that hung in the air like a storm cloud. I started spending more time away, going out with friends or staying late at work just to avoid the suffocating atmosphere at home. Every time I came back, it was the same. Mom would give me tight-lipped looks, her disappointment radiating like heat. Dad would grunt a half-hearted acknowledgement before returning to his newspaper or TV. Jake, of course, kept up his act, basking in the attention and concern they showered on him, while pretending I didn't exist. The worst part was the guilt. No matter how justified I felt in exposing Jake, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd somehow made everything worse. My parents' anger, the fractured family dynamic, it all weighed on me, even though I knew I wasn't the one who had lied. One night, I overheard Jake talking to Mom in the kitchen. His voice was low, but the smugness in his tone was unmistakable. I don't know why he hates me so much, he said. I've tried to be patient, but it's hard when someone's always attacking you for no reason. Mom's voice was soft but firm. Don't worry about it, honey. Your dad and I will handle it. You just focus on getting better. The rage that bubbled up inside me was almost too much to contain. Jake wasn't just lying. He was painting himself as the victim, turning our parents against me even more. I wanted to storm in and confront him right then and there, but I knew it would only make things worse. Instead, I went back to my room, shutting the door behind me and sinking onto my bed. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. No matter what I did, no matter how much truth I uncovered, Jake always managed to come out on top. And my parents, people who had always been my anchors, my support system, were now looking at me like I was the problem. The isolation was crushing. I couldn't talk to my friends about it without sounding like I was airing my family's dirty laundry, and I couldn't bring it up with my parents without risking another argument. For the first time in my life, I felt like I didn't belong in my own family. Jake had poisoned the well, and I wasn't sure if things could ever go back to the way they were. But deep down, I knew one thing. I couldn't let him win. I didn't know how, and I didn't know when, but I was determined to find a way to expose the truth. no matter how much it hurt. The storm had been brewing for weeks. Tensions were high, and Jake continued to play his role as the victim to perfection. Mom and Dad doted on him, making sure he was comfortable and supported, while I was left to fend off their cold stares and clipped remarks. But even the best lies have their limits. Jake's carefully constructed story began to unravel one afternoon when Dad got a call from the bank. I wasn't there to witness it, but I could hear Dad's raised voice from my room. "What do you mean, thousands of dollars?" he barked into the phone. There was a long pause, and then, more incredulously, "Medical bills? No, that's not possible. We haven't authorized anything like that." I crept closer to the kitchen, peeking around the corner. Dad was pacing, his face red with frustration, while Mom stood frozen near the counter, her hand covering her mouth. After a few more tense exchanges, Dad hung up and turned to Mom. "Jake's been withdrawing money from the account," he said, his voice shaking. "He told the bank it was for his treatments." Mom's eyes widened, tears already forming. "That can't be right," she said weakly. "He wouldn't do that without telling us. Would he?" Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Finally, Dad's jaw tightened, and he marched toward Jake's room. Mom hesitated, then followed, her face a mixture of disbelief and dread. I stayed back, listening as Dad pounded on Jake's door. "Jake, get out here. Now!" There was a pause, then the sound of Jake's door creaking open. "What's going on?" he mumbled, his voice thick with feigned confusion. "You've been taking money from our account," Dad said, his voice cold and controlled. "Thousands of dollars. Do you care to explain?" Jake stammered. It's for the bills. I told you, the treatments aren't covered by insurance. I was going to tell you." "Don't lie to me, Jake," Dad shouted, his voice booming. "The bank says you've been making personal withdrawals. And I called the doctor's office. You're not even a patient there." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, Jake seemed at a loss for words. I can explain," he said weakly, but the conviction in his voice was gone. Mom's voice was barely above a whisper. "Jake, please tell me this isn't true." Jake looked between them, his usual bravado crumbling under their scrutiny. "Okay, fine," he snapped finally, his tone defensive. "I exaggerated. I needed some space. And I figured this was the only way you'd leave me alone." Mom gasped, her hands flying to her face as the weight of his words hit her. Dad, on the other hand, looked like he'd been punched in the gut. "Exaggerated?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "You lied to us. You let us think you were dying, Jake." Jake raised his hands defensively. "It's not like that. I didn't mean for it to get this far. You just what?" Dad interrupted. "Wanted money? Attention? Sympathy? How could you do this to us?" I stepped into the hallway then, unable to stay silent any longer. "I told you," I said quietly, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and vindication. "I tried to tell you, but you wouldn't listen." Jake turned to me, his face twisting in fury. "Oh great, here comes the 'I told you so' speech. Is this what you wanted? To make me look bad?" "You didn't need my help to look bad, Jake," I said coldly. "You did that all on your own." Mom burst into tears then, sinking into the nearest chair. "How could you?" she sobbed. "We would have done anything for you, Jake. We were ready to spend our savings, to give you everything you needed. And it was all a lie." Jake's shoulders slumped as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said weakly. I felt like I didn't matter anymore. Like nobody cared unless there was something wrong with me. That's not an excuse." Dad roared. "Do you have any idea what you've put us through? The worry, the sleepless nights, the financial strain. You lied to us, Jake. Your own family." For the first time, Jake didn't have a snappy comeback or a deflection. He just stood there, looking small and defeated, as the weight of his lies finally came crashing down. I didn't feel triumphant. If anything, I felt hollow, watching my parents' heartbreak, hearing the raw pain in their voices. It wasn't the vindication I'd imagined. It was just sad. That night, the house was quieter than it had been in weeks. Mom locked herself in her room, while Dad sat silently at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of fake medical bills Jake had left behind. As for Jake, he retreated to his room and didn't come out again. For once, he wasn't avoiding me. He was avoiding everyone. The truth had finally come out, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of something, a breaking point we could never fully recover from. In the aftermath of Jake's confession, the house felt like a hollow shell of what it once was. The warmth, the easy laughter, the sense of safety, it was all gone, replaced by a silence that weighed on all of us. My parents couldn't look at Jake without their disappointment showing, and Jake, stripped of his lies, avoided them entirely. For the first few days, I waited for things to improve, hoping that the truth might bring some sense of resolution. But instead, it only deepened the cracks in our family. Mom and Dad apologized to me, several times in fact, but their words felt hollow, like they were checking a box rather than truly making amends. "We're sorry we didn't believe you," Mom said one evening, her voice heavy with regret. "You were right all along, and we should have listened." "Yeah," I replied, not meeting her gaze. "You should have." It wasn't just their refusal to believe me that hurt. It was how quick they were to write me off, to assume my intentions were malicious. Every time I thought about the accusations they'd thrown at me, jealousy, cruelty, selfishness, I felt a pang of bitterness I couldn't shake. Jake, unsurprisingly, retreated entirely. He spent most of his time in his room, only emerging when he thought no one else was around. The few times we did cross paths, he avoided eye contact, mumbling half-hearted apologies that felt more like an obligation than genuine remorse. One afternoon, while I was grabbing a snack in the kitchen, he walked in and stopped abruptly when he saw me. "Look," he said awkwardly, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "I'm sorry. For everything." I stared at him, searching for any sign of sincerity in his expression. "Why'd you do it, Jake?" I asked, my voice quieter than I expected. "Why would you lie about something like that?" He sighed, looking down at the floor. "I don't know," he muttered. "I guess I felt like no one cared about me anymore. You've got your own life, and Mom and Dad were always on my case about getting a job or moving out. I just wanted them to stop for a while. I didn't think it'd go this far." His words might have explained his actions, but they didn't excuse them. "You didn't think about what it'd do to them?" I asked, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "You let them think you were dying, Jake. They were ready to drain their savings for you." He flinched, but he didn't argue. "I know," he said softly. "I screwed up. I know that." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. But then I remembered the weeks of lies, the manipulation, and the pain he'd caused, and whatever sympathy I had evaporated. Shortly after that conversation, Jake moved out. It wasn't a dramatic exit. No slammed doors or shouting matches. Just a quiet departure on a rainy Saturday morning. He packed his things, gave Mom and Dad a strained hug, and left without saying goodbye to me. His relationship with our parents was strained, but not completely broken. Mom and Dad still checked in on him, occasionally mentioning that he was doing okay or that he'd started taking steps to get his life back on track. But things between us were different. I didn't have the energy or the desire to rebuild a relationship with him, at least not yet. As for my parents, I kept them at arm's length. I still visited on holidays and birthdays, but the closeness we'd once shared was gone. I couldn't shake the memory of their anger, their accusations, and the way they'd sided with Jake without hesitation. Over time, the bitterness dulled, but it never fully disappeared. I forgave them in small pieces, not because they deserved it, but because holding on to the resentment felt like carrying a weight I couldn't bear. The experience taught me a painful lesson. The truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it just leaves you standing alone, staring at the ruins of what used to be. I don't regret exposing Jake's lies. He needed to be held accountable, and my parents deserved to know the truth. But if I'd known how much it would cost, I might have thought twice before pulling back the curtain. In the end, the family we were before Jake's lie was gone, and I had to come to terms with the fact that it wasn't coming back. Sometimes the only thing you can do is pick up the pieces and try to move forward. But even now, I can't help but wonder if some pieces are better left behind.